Welcome, Philippe.
Hello, and good evening, and welcome. Bienvenidos, friends of the Hispanic Society, to a special installment of our program, Las Tertulias de Arte Hispano, or Hispanic Art Gatherings. Thank you once again to our members who have joined monthly since May, and welcome to all who are tuning in for the first time. We continue these conversations on the first and sometimes on the second Tuesday of each month, and it's always at 5 p.m. If you are not a member yet, please do consider joining by going to our website, hispanicsociety.org, and search for membership under support. And I underscore the word support, especially in this particular time. Additionally, I would like to remind you all, our members, that the Hispanic Society is pleased to present the outdoor installation Treasures on the Terrace, which is open from now until December 6th and includes photographic reproductions, big reproductions, of works found in the collection. The installation includes text and audio in 2 languages, of course, and can also be explored online through our website. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Hispanic Society's Head of Prints and Photographs, Dr. Patrick Lenaghan, a pleasure that I've had at least twice before, so you know him well. We expect to have a lively discussion about the museum's collection of prints illustrating Cervantes' masterpiece, Don Quixote. Just 2 words about Patrick in brief. He is a graduate of the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University, something we have in common. Before joining the Hispanic Society, he worked for a while at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we have that in common as well. He is now the Hispanic Society of America, and he's head of the Department of Prints and Photographs. He has organized numerous international exhibitions, but one in particular, called Imágenes del Quijote, at the Museo Nacional del Prado, is most appropriate, obviously, for today. It outlined the changing visual interpretation of the novel, this great novel, through its illustrations. He has also written widely on Spanish Renaissance and Baroque sculpture in books and journals. Now, after Patrick's presentation, we will have a brief conversation and invite you to join us afterward by submitting your own questions in the comments section. You may submit your questions and comments at any point during the discussion, and I thank you for doing so. I may have a few questions of my own. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patrick Leland.
Thank you, Philippe. Since in previous Tertulias, we've discussed the photographs and paintings of the museum, I thought we could visit another section today, the prints. We hold many important works in that medium, and as so often with the Hispanic Society, it is not just the pieces themselves, but the focus underlying them that sets the collection apart. As a way into the subject, I've chosen images illustrating Don Quixote, where we hold not only about 4,000 prints, but also preparatory drawings. Before beginning, I want to outline a few points quickly. Many people underestimate illustration, imagining that the artist simply recreates the text. But actually, the work requires interpretive decisions. In the case of Don Quixote, it involves basic yet major choices. The story seems straightforward. An impoverished Castilian gentleman, an hidalgo, reads too many books of chivalry and loses his mind. In his madness, he decides to venture out as a knight-errant and right all the wrongs he finds. Unfortunately, he finds a different world, but one that does not understand him, and he suffers a series of misadventures. Today, most people know the novel as the romantic quest of a failed dreamer, but from its publication in 1605 to the late 18th century, people read it as a comic story of a madman. Although the point may shock us today, the historical evidence is unambiguous. In fact, over the course of our tertulia, we will be looking at this shift from the comic interpretation to the romantic one, because the prints that we're going to look at reflect the history of the novel's reception as seen through the history of its editions. When the novel proved a hit and a bestseller, a call for illustrated editions arose, which publishers and artists rushed to fill. As artists drew the characters and episodes, they offered their own interpretations, perhaps none more striking than the simple one of how to draw the protagonist and how at the outset he loses his mind while reading. Wait a second, why am I not? Okay, so what have I done wrong? That the screen sharing is paused. There we are. Okay, so in the 17th century, we have the first of the series that I'd like to look at, which is the version of Jacques Lanier and Jérôme David. We see here a vigorous madman who will go on to inflict serious damage even as he takes his lumps. In the 18th century, the Royal Academy, yes.
Patrick, we're not seeing the slides.
All right, hold on a second. What have I done wrong? I was afraid this. Yes. All right, let's try this again. All right, you see them now, Philippe?
No, I see merely your title slide.
All right, all right, let me.
That may be my fault.
No. I am sorry. I apologize. Let's try this again. Okay, now.
That looks promising.
Now you see the title slide, correct?
Now I see Daniel. No. You had were okay before.
What have you got now?
David and Jacques Lanier.
Okay, Don Quixote reading, correct?
Correct.
Oh, I apologize. All right, so we have the 17th century image of this madman who is a very vigorous character who's going to go on and inflict serious damage on his opponents as he reads. It's a rough and tumble image. Now, we have an 18th century image, which I hope you can see. Can you see it, Philippe?
I certainly do. You're doing fine.
Okay, brilliant. This is the 18th century edition issued by the Royal Academy with drawings of principally by Antonio Carnitero. And here we have a more restrained setting, neoclassical overtones, though we're still looking at what is primarily a comic interpretation. Over the following years, different interpretations arose. We have this one by Danielle Uravieta Vierge. We have a realistically drawn space that crowds around the figure, suggesting the claustrophobic atmosphere surrounding our hero. But perhaps the most sympathetic one is this one by Gustave Doré. Here we have the world runs riot surrounding the knight who's carried away by his reading. Clearly, as the chivalric world takes shape around him, we're meant to sympathize with this figure who is really a sweet dreamer, it seems. So drawing on the riches of the Hispanic society, I would like to look at the first three examples in detail so we can watch how the artist's interpretation develops, and we can trace his creative process by looking at the sketches each artist made as he developed his images. So for the first one, we have these by Jacques Lanier and Jérôme David. The drawings are generally by Jérôme David, and the set is issued by Jacques Lanier. It marks the first significant effort to depict the story of Don Quixote in an extended sequence of prints. Although generally ascribed to Jacques Lanier, he's the publisher of the set, and he went on to issue a number of similar sets. He did one of Till Eugenspiel, and also had one in the works of Quevedo's picaresque novel of El Buscón. With their delight in earthy realism, all of these projects resemble the tone adopted in the treatment of Cervantes' novel and suggest how Lanier approached his material and what he wanted when he turned to his team of engravers, including Jérôme David. So we've got here perhaps the most famous scene today, the episode of the attack on the windmills. Riding on the plains of La Mancha with Sancho, Quixote sees windmills, which he takes for lawless giants, and he proposes to attack them. Sancho objects, but Quixote perseveres in his assault. His inanimate foes deal him a crushing defeat. In the drawing, David emphasizes the physical impact of the collision with a broad humor that resembles slapsticks. He's chosen the moment immediately after Quixote's ill-advised assault, as the knight clutches his broken lance. The other half is still in the wing of the windmill. Quixote is still falling to the ground, and he's about to be trapped under his horse. Sancho is rushing up in great distress. The characters' emphatic gestures and blank facial expressions present the event as broad comedy and nothing else. And this focus on a rough and tumble humor prevails through the set, as we can see in the next two images I've shown. In the image on the left, Quixote and Sancho are deep in the woods on the night when they hear tremendous banging sound. Quixote proposes to go off and attack it. Sancho doesn't like the sound of this, so he ties the horse Rocinante, Quixote's horse, legs together so it can't move, and he huddles close to Quixote. He's terrified and he needs to relieve himself, but he doesn't dare go off. So he relieves himself in the presence of his master, who, although he may not be able to see anything, can certainly smell what's going on. And he tells Sancho, "You smell it, it's not like the finest perfume." On the right, we have an episode where Sancho and Quixote are recovering from one of their misadventures. Quixote has concocted a hideous mix, which he believes to be a magical potion that will cure him. So faithfully, he takes it. It upsets his stomach. He throws up onto Sancho, who on receiving this replies in kind. And here too, we see the moment of the regurgitation portrayed with the same similar physical frankness. And it's this kind of humor that the set enjoys most, and it seems that this is the humor that a lot of the first readers found truly funny in the book. But as readers continued to delight in the novel in the 18th century, subtle shifts in the comic focus emerged. By the time we reach the edition which the Royal Academy of Spain issued in 1780, we find a different focus. Among its many elegant features are these illustrations by Antonio Carnitero. He in the end supplied 19 of the images, which is almost 2/3 of the project, but even more importantly, it's their restraint, grace, and realism which set the tone for so much of the set. A gifted draftsman, Carnitero made numerous studies for the project. Almost 40 of these survive today, of which the lion's share, 23, are in the Hispanic Society. As a boy, Carnitero had traveled to Italy with his older brother. Later, he enjoyed a successful career, achieving several posts in Madrid, and the illustrations for Don Quixote bear this out. The edition, moreover, is remarkable for the care with which the Royal Academy produced it and the close supervision of the images that they exercised. They provided detailed instructions for each scene, which they expected the artist to follow exactly. And they were not above rejecting images by artists when they felt that their work did not meet the expectations. Bearing this in mind, we should consider Carnitero's images not simply as expressions of his artistry, but also as conforming to an officially sanctioned interpretation. So we have here the scene where Sancho Panza presents the enchanted Dulcinea to Don Quixote. Carnitero has depicted the moment where Don Quixote has sent Sancho off to give a message to the knight's beloved Dulcinea. Sancho is in a bit of a quandary because Dulcinea doesn't exist and Sancho knows this. So what is he to do? He decides to play on Quixote's madness. So he says, the next women coming down the road, I'm going to tell Quixote this is Dulcinea. And when he says, but who are these? I'll just tell him Dulcinea is enchanted. So sure enough, 3 peasant women come down the road. Sancho presents them. And we have here this moment where Sancho kneels before the women, gesturing solemnly. We have the absorbed but perplexed and confused Quixote and the equally puzzled peasant women. And at the same time, if you look in the back, the artist has established a distinctive setting which carefully describes the landscape of the church and the village. And the costumes are also quite plausible for a Spanish setting. The drawing, which you see on the right, comes from an intermediate stage in the process. It seems that Carnitero would begin with studies for poses, gestures, and expressions. Then he made line drawings, like the one you see here, that established the outlines of the figures and forms. And then finally, he created a drawing with ink washes that had the shadings, which he would deliver to the engraver who would make the plate. Now, the scene, as we look at it, has sort of a self-evident quality, but a comparison can help us get a sense of it, of what Carnitero has achieved. On the right, you've got an image from the 19th century by a French illustrator, Granville, and he hasn't really cared for the Spanish setting. He's got what look like French peasants of his day, and he's got a very different sense of character. Sancho is clearly fat, round. One can imagine him greasy. But the best part for me is the drawing of Quixote with the eyes popping out of his head. The solemn restraint of Carnitero gives way to this just total incomprehension that Granville shows us. As we look at other drawings that Carnitero made, we can see how he went back and changed his mind. For instance, if you look at the book, you have this scene where Quixote and Sancho are at the palace of the dukes in the second part. They come across these aristocrats who've read the book and are thrilled to meet Quixote and Sancho, and they arrange various nightly adventures for them. One of them is that they're going to ride this wooden horse, which will take them miles away to an enchanted island where Quixote can right the wrongs he finds there. In this case, we can see how Carnitero developed his composition on this image on the left, but then, interestingly, he went back and changed his mind. If you look, there's a figure at the bottom on the right of the drawing, which is removed in this pencil drawing, and then we come to the final print. So we can watch him as he changes his mind developing the composition. Another interesting thing is that as Carnitero worked, when he started this, he had in his mind the most popular set of images, one of them, by this French artist, Charles-Antoine Quapel. And you can see that Charles-Antoine Quapel is very much in the style galant of the French moment. These are images made for tapestries. They have a playful sense of elegance, and they're very courtly. What Carnitero has done is that he's adopted it, but he has given it a more serene and sedate quality, which is doubtless something that is more in keeping with the neoclassic aesthetic of the period, and something that the Academy, who is supervising the set, would have appreciated. And I think the contrast really comes through when you compare the finished prints of the two. Looking at the Hispanic Society drawings, though, we can actually, in another case, see Carnitero working out his ideas. And this is in the scene towards the end of the second part, when Quixote is defeated in a joust outside of Barcelona. Quixote's friends have been conspiring how they can bring him back. They send one of their members out, disguised as a knight, who will defeat him and impose conditions that as part of his defeat, he has to return home. It's a climactic moment because from this point on, Quixote is defeated and he has to return home. So it's also a tricky scene to portray, and it's very effectively rendered here as the friend disguised has defeated him and has his lance hovered over him. There's a sense of action, but there's also a sense of grandeur. What looks so easy, however, was carefully thought out and worked out. You can see how Carnitero has been playing with the moment of the one figure falling off the horse as the other stands over him. And he's also trying to work his way through what the Barcelona port should look like. There's a gate in one, there's a quay on the other. And we finally come to something like the wash drawing, that is when Carnitero has the figures as he wants them, and then this gets passed on into the print. And it's, I think, important to remember this progress because it shows that what looks so easy in the finished print is actually the result of careful thought and work. A lack of recognition still plagues the last artist I want to look at, Danielle Uravieta Vierge. And in his lifetime, however, connoisseurs praised his drawings for their technical mastery and realism. Moreover, he created these knowing that they would illustrate books and journals, and as such, they found a large and admiring public. His compositions also graced editions of classics of Spanish literature like Quijote and El Buscón, volumes which today still occupy a special place for book collectors. As an artist, Vierge's career straddles France and Spain. He began his training in the Royal Academy in Madrid, but his family moved to France in 1870, where he spent the rest of his career. in which he excelled in illustration. Even so, he often returned to Spain at important moments. And we see here one, looking for inspiration in Spanish villages and countrysides, Vierge made a sketching trip in 1893 through La Mancha with Carlos Vázquez Úbeda. The resulting watercolors, in turn, served as illustrations in their own right for a book, Yacachi's On the Trail of Don Quixote, which was published in 1896. 2 years later, knowledge of Vierge's work on Cervantes' novel, that he'd made this trip with an eye towards this project, had become so widespread that an article appeared discussing Vierge's forthcoming illustrations with great anticipation. At first glance, Vierge's work can seem like a straightforward realist vision in which the humble interiors or the broad expanses of La Mancha reflect his firsthand observations. In the first image we saw, Vierge depicts what looks like a perfectly plausible room in a Spanish hidalgo's house, filled with bookcases, the low ceiling with the channels called vigas. But when we compare it to the preparatory drawing, we can see how the artist developed his ideas, that the bookcases are an addition. He's shifted Quixote's pose and changed the perspective to create this powerful image with its tension between realism and the strong pictorial effect. The care with which he developed the setting appears in another scene we have here, which is he's got the details of the room in Quixote's house, and he's carefully developing them. And you can see how he's worked the idea of the chairs, the table, the corridor, the space. And this shows the care with which he is developing his images and creating this setting in which he's going to place his figures. At the same time, when he works, there's an awareness of graphic design. We're not quite sure of the history of all of these drawings. It seems that he may have been working on the project with another publisher. It's uncertain, but he draws and he creates these images knowing that they're going into a book. So he creates this drawing of Quixote setting out, but when it actually shows up in the book, it's flipped because the page is on the left-hand side. And if they did it faithfully, Quixote would be heading off into the corner of the book, whereas in the book itself, he's heading in a way that makes more sense. Throughout this, he's attentive to the graphic design, and he's also aware of how his sense of realism and at the same time his development of an elegant graphic style with his elegant lines and calligraphic qualities create these images. So when we come to the encounter with the windmills, we can see how Vierge drew on his experience of those he had seen on his travel for the perspective and the sense of space into which he's going to insert his characters. We can see how he remembers what it was like to come near them and how they stand in the landscape. So he's taken his experience of firsthand knowledge of these windmills, and he's put then his figures of Quixote and Sancho into this setting. In another instance where he does this, I think we can see even more extreme how he takes the realism of the place and then adds to it his sense of these elegant calligraphic lines that create almost an arabesque pattern that runs across the surface. Here we have the moment where Don Quixote and Sancho are taken by a local guide to a cave called the Cave of Montecinos. Don Quixote's intention is to descend into the cave and to encounter the nightly adventure of the vision, where he will meet Montecinos and Montesinos' cousin, another knight, Durandarte. But before they can even get into the cave, they have to clear the path, they have to clear the entrance, they have to clear the brambles and the thicket, and as they do so, a whole host of birds, crows, bats come flying out. It's a perplexing and troubling symbolism, but Vierge has been to what is believed to be the Cave of Montesinos, so he's drawn. He has, from his sketchbook, we know that he knows what the entrance into the cave looks like. So he's got a sense of the space of it, but he also has to put his understanding of the figures and the composition into it. And once he's got that, then he superimposes onto it his elegant lines and his love of these solid black shapes, which are perfect here for the birds and the cloak of the man at the top there with the sword who's attacking it. Now, our friend Carnitero has also depicted this image, and the contrast, I think, is very interesting because it calls into question. Carnitero is very clear. We can understand easily how Don Quixote is hacking away at his entrance and the birds are coming out, whereas Vierge has got this arabesque and calligraphic quality in it, his image, that he's built onto it. So I think you can say that with his sense of place, he set the principal action of the figures clearing their way, but he achieves this decorative effect. One can appreciate the effect as we make this comparison. And you know, you've got the neoclassic restraint and clarity of Carnitero, and you've got this elegance of Vierge. So I think that as we've looked at these three artists very on a flying tour, we can see how each one summons his talent to develop their images. At the same time, the prints also are reflecting a broader shift in the interpretation of the novel, from the broad comedy we saw in the first set of David and Lenaghan to the more refined comedy and we see with Carnitero, or to this elegant version of Vierge, or the romantic interpretation we saw fleetingly at the beginning with Gustave Doré. Thank you.
Thank you for absolutely wonderful presentation and fascinating one. I presume all the drawings, the prints, the books, the watercolors that you showed, all of them are in the collections of the Hispanic Society?
Absolutely, yes. It was one of the pleasures of doing the show for Imágenes del Quijote, was to be able to do this all sort of in-house.
Oh, that's terrific. Tell me, I mean, your presentation leads to a fairly obvious question, which is why are so many of these illustrations by non-Spaniards?
Sorry.
I could go further and say, since you've shown a number of 19th century ones, and by French artists such as Doré, for example, can this be tied in also to a fascination of the French in the 19th century for Spain? And so many novels and so forth written on a Spanish theme.
Yes, I think so. Underlying what I found as I did the project is that it reflects a reception history. It reflects many things. The history of reading of the novel. It reflects the history of publication, and that the printers turned to the artists they worked with nearby. So the editions from France have French illustrations. The English editions turn to English printers. And in general, the bulk of the book printing occurs in the north. The 1780 Ibarra Quijote, sponsored by the Royal Academy, is in part a bit of chauvinistic pride and sense of discomfort on the part of the Academy that the most luxurious edition had been published, the most luxurious edition in Spanish with notes had been published in London, and that the images that most defined Don Quixote in the 18th century were French. If Don Quixote was to be the Spanish novel par excellence, really they, the Spaniards, needed to bring their game up a notch, and that's why they took so much trouble with the edition.
You mentioned when you spoke about Carnicero early on, his officially sanctioned illustrations. Did he have to pass them by the Inquisition?
No, the Academy. They're officially sanctioned in that the Academy is an official institution, and they get very precise instructions. You know, you will draw this there will be these figures, it will have this. It's because you would think the text is pretty clear, but actually it isn't. And the academicians took it upon themselves to make sure that these artists didn't goof and do anything because there was a great deal of unhappiness at the French and English images that they were looking at.
Well, we keep talking of French and English images. Was Cervantes actually more popular outside of Spain than in Spain? How early were editions in Spain printed with illustrations, for example?
Well, that's a question that's easy to ask and hard to answer. I have to unpick it a little to answer it because obviously the first editions are in Spain of Don Quixote, and the edition history takes off. But the illustrated editions come a little bit later. The Lenaghan David set is 1650 to 52. Then editions in the north follow in the second half of the 17th century, and in London in the second half of the 17th century. The French artist Quapel takes center stage with the images he designs for the Gobelin tapestries, which he also issues he gets a copyright, and he issues luxurious prints, which then get copied in England and France and Holland, and cause a great deal of dissemination. So you can trace the popularity of the images that way, but that's not quite the question you asked. The popularity of Quixote and Cervantes follows perhaps two different routes. In Spain, they recognize him as a great writer, but they recognize him as a comic writer and perhaps not their foremost writer. If in the 17th century you were to ask a literate Spaniard who are the greatest writers, you would get names that didn't include Cervantes. The French and English, however, quickly read the book, loved it, and there's the anecdote of the French ambassador coming to Spain in the early part of the 17th century and learning that Cervantes is living not quite in poverty, but hardly doing well, and is amazed that how is it possible that this great writer is not being feted and wealthy. And I think that speaks right there to a level of appreciation. The other thing is that the knowledge of Cervantes's novels passed very quickly to France and England, so that there's a quick readership and a popular, and he strikes a chord.
Fascinating. Christina, do we have questions from our members? We should give them a chance to.
Yes, we do. Thank you both so much. And one of the comments actually is that these images would make a wonderful exhibition. So Patrick, has this been done already? Are there plans for this in the future?
Well, we did this in great part in the exhibition that was at the Prado, and then went to the Museo de Bellas Artes in Seville. And there was the following year an exhibition devoted exclusively to Vierge. I thank the person who makes that question because I love the subject, and I'm always happy to exhibit them. I think, though, that in 2005, the Spanish world was galvanized by the 400th anniversary of the novel, and Spain was overwhelmed with celebrations of Don Quixote. And in Spain, I think there was a Don Quixote fatigue, so that when the centenary for the second part in 2015 or later of Cervantes' own death came in, those events passed without corresponding celebrations.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question asking, have any 20th century or contemporary artists attempted similar works based on Don Quixote?
That's an excellent question, and it's actually really revealing. It's an excellent question because in a sense, the two greatest, well, I shouldn't say the two greatest, two of the greatest Spanish 20th century printmakers, Picasso, if we consider him Spanish, and Dali, in their different ways, underscore the issues and how the dynamic changes. Picasso there's the famous poster that everyone sees and knows There's also a very rare sugar lift aqua tint from the 30s, his neoclassic period, that we actually have at the Hispanic Society. There are, I think, only 6 known impressions. But the thing with Picasso is that by the time Picasso is working, Quixote is the failed dreamer. His relationship with Dulcinea is platonic beyond platonic. And this has absolutely nothing that appeals to the self-image that Picasso is creating for himself. So that these images are interesting, but they're sort of misses. On the other hand, Dali is sort of gleeful in his surrealist take. And there is a portfolio that Dali did, and we also have that at the Hispanic Society, in which the event of creating it was perhaps as much as the illustration. They filled snail shells with colors of ink and then shot them at the plates. So it was as much a surrealist event as the actual image. But the problem both of these artists have is that illustration requires discipline and a publisher and an edition, because you have to create a character who's going to travel through the book and be recognizable on page 1 as at the end. You can't just cherry pick these images you want. You could, but it's not the same thing as illustrating an edition. And it requires, therefore, a discipline, and it requires a publisher. The second thing is that the unfortunate prejudice that illustration runs up against hits this, because as art is becoming non-representational in the course of the 20th century, the idea of illustrating a text becomes even more removed from the idea of what it is to be an artist. So if Dali and Picasso can slide their images of Quixote safely into their careers and their corpus of works, it's harder for someone who's working abstractly to do this. So it's a tantalizing problem, which I think the question reveals as much about the underlying dynamics. And the irony is that if you had to say which is the 20th century edition of Quixote by a Spanish artist that is of a book that is most famous, Vierge, the 1906 edition, in some ways makes as strong a case as any. And there are others that in the 20s and 30s, but you don't go too much further.
That's really interesting, Patrick. And actually, there's a related question about this iconic Picasso image. Do you think that these iconic images can be somewhat reductive and possibly not a very positive influence in terms of actually promoting the reading of the novel?
Well, yes, I agree completely. The novel, depending on your edition and the size of your print, can run anywhere from 700 to 1,000 pages, and it's a tough read because just physically it requires you to sit down and take your time. And I think the question is very well put, because the reductive quality of the print sort of comes with a stereotypical view. And the beauty of the novel is the way Cervantes takes his concept and builds on it, expands on it, and plays on it, so that by the end of the second part, Don Quixote and Sancho run into these characters, the Duke and Duchess, who've read the first part of the book, and on the basis of this create adventures for Quixote to have. And Quixote, who's been busy recreating the world in his image for most of the first part, begins, to his surprise, to find that the world is starting to look like one of his nightly adventures. And this is sometimes almost as troubling to him.
Thank you. We have one more question from a member. Does the Hispanic Society also have illustrations, for example, of Lazarillo de Tormes or other Siglo de Oro theater works, or any other plays or novels even from the 17th and 18th?
That too is a very good question, that the answer to it takes us back in some ways to the question of reception history, because the long and the short is yes and no. Yes, there are illustrated editions of other works by Cervantes, but they don't always play out the way we expect. And our idea of the literary canon, what's important of Cervantes, and what readers at different times thought was important, changes. It also reflects where a publisher thinks he can issue a set of books and find someone to buy them. So the question of what is illustrated hangs on that. And a lot of editions of plays in 17th, 18th century are not designed with as luxurious editions to have images attached to them. They're in a much cheaper format that doesn't include illustrations. I mean, we have in our Carnitero set of drawings a very interesting drawing, which I published somewhere else, a frontispiece for Cervantes' Persiles. It's a frontispiece that was never turned into a print, although I'm pretty sure I know the edition for which it was intended. After the success of the Royal Academy's Don Quixote, another Madrid publisher, Sancha, issued a very elegant set of the complete works of Cervantes. And so all of the works are there. The novelas ejemplares, Persiles, Galatea, and they're all accompanied with illustrations, but not on the same scale as Quixote. So for instance, there's only one illustration for each of the novelas ejemplares. And in Persiles, you can have 3 or 4 in each of the volumes, and there are 2 volumes, I believe, for it. So it's limited. And what that means is that right off the bat, the artist doesn't have as much scope to develop an image. But Persiles, unfortunately, has proved to be a much harder novel to understand, and it hasn't enjoyed the same wide success. So this one edition of Sancha is sort of a blip. There are other illustrated editions, but it's not enough that you can trace the history of the reception the way you can with Quixote. I mean, one of the projects I'm curious to do, but it's very hard, and I don't know that when I will be able to sit down and do it calmly, is the parallel of Cervantes and Shakespeare. Because Shakespeare, the plays are editions of plays, and it's only until later, into the 18th century, that printed images begin to appear. But because you have the same problem that I just described with the individual works of Cervantes hits the plays, you don't have one volume with images throughout it that allow the artist to develop and play with a concept.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. One has learned a great deal, Patrick. You're a font of knowledge. And I must say, it's wonderful to hear how deep and extensive are the holdings of the Hispanic Society and its library and its collection of works on paper that allow us to really trace such a remarkable panorama of such an iconic figure and book. So thank you for all the work you did for this Tertulia. And we are thrilled, and I'm always delighted when there are such good questions asked and when so many of our members do join. I want to remind you that our next Tertulia will take place on Tuesday, not the first Tuesday of December, but the second, which is on the 8th of December. And it will be a somewhat different kind of a Tertulia in that we will be going out of town totally. Our exhibition of the Tesoros, the treasures of the Hispanic Society, is on view at the moment at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And the Tertulia conversation with James Arno, the curator who put the show together in Houston, and that should also be fascinating. So I look forward to seeing you all on the 8th of December. I hope many of you, if you are not members, will join. if you are members, will consider it as your obligation to the Hispanic Society to ask many of your friends to join, and have a wonderful evening and see you next month.
Thank you both.
Thanks.